Hello there, and welcome to the Great Divergence, Unit 3. By the 1500s, Portugal became the first empire in human history to connect multiple regions by itself, possessing territories in Europe, South America, Africa, and Asia. They ushered in an era of globalization very different from the reach of previous empires. Beginning in the 1500s, Europe found its power growing and even surpassing the wealth of Eastern Asia, which stagnated in the centuries following. In this unit, we will investigate the Great Divergence, in which the great shift from regional to global power occurred, especially in the West. To begin, we're going to look at the Wild Wild West, the chaotic rise and expansion of Europe. And to see where we are headed, we will start with the nation-state, going into the Protestant Reformation, the Wild Wild West itself, and then finally with the diffusion of the nation-state. And this will lead us to the very first question. What is the nation-state?
And now for something completely different.
Okay, to start things off, we're going to take a look at a little vocabulary. The first term is sovereignty, which means that authority over a territory rests with legitimate rulers of independent and inviolable states. Now, inviolable means that other countries must respect the land and affairs within that country's borders. Now, in the Middle Ages, Europe was mostly dominated by feudalism, with monarchs and nobles sharing power and land. Over time, however, monarchs grew in power. And to take a look at European sovereignty, modern statehood can trace its roots to the laws set up after the 30 Years' War, which occurred in the mid-17th century, which a conflict we will investigate later. All right, another term is state. Now, state is a politically organized territory with a permanent population, administered by a sovereign government, and recognized by the international community. It is synonymous with the term country. To look at Spain as an example, in 1469, King Ferdinand of Castile married Queen Isabella of Aragon, uniting their Catholic lands and re-establishing the state of Spain. Now, nation, which is often used mistakenly as a synonym for the term state, is really quite different. A nation is a group of people who share a common bond, whether that be language, ethnicity, religion, or any other shared attribute. So, from ancient times to the Roman conquest, to the centuries under Moorish rule, even to the Reconquista, the nation of Spain has evolved through time, just as the people have. Now simply combine the terms, and you get a nation-state, which is a state that coincides with the area settled by a nation. Pretty straightforward. So the Spanish nation-state was sought after once Ferdinand and Isabella united their lands. Since people who identify each other as similar get along better, the Spanish people looked to remove those among them who were different. And this coincided with the Reconquista, kicking out the Moors and the Jews primarily, all done with the assistance of the Catholic Church, no less. This map shows the dominance of Catholicism throughout Europe from around 750 AD or CE up to the time of the middle of the 1400s. Now, this second map shows Europe around a century later, after the effects of the Protestant Reformation, which will be described later on. The Reformation gave way to other Christian faiths, such as Lutheranism, shown here in green, or Calvinism, shown in blue, and even Anglicanism, which evolved into England, and there in yellow. So the question comes into, how did the Catholic Church lose its dominant position at the expense of rising nation-states? To find the origin of this, we have to find a starting point. So let's go back in time to the Middle Ages, when feudalism dominated Europe, and most of the world for that matter. John Wycliffe, an English theology professor in the mid-14th century, is referred to as the morning star of the Reformation. Now, the Reformation was a major religious movement that didn't truly begin until around 2 centuries later. Wycliffe criticized the church's selling of indulgences or pardons from sin, among other issues. He also helped translate the Bible from Latin into English. His followers were called Lollards, meaning mumblers, a derogatory nickname implying they were uneducated. They were persecuted and sometimes hung or burned to death, or as you see here, all the above. Jan Hus, who was influenced by Wycliffe, criticized the church from within Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. Unfortunately for him, in 1415 he was convicted of heresy and burned to death at the stake. For the time being, the church had managed to silence its dissidents. So why did these movements remain relatively local, and fail to erupt into the regional and religious reforms that occurred more than a century later? Well, the velocity of transmission of ideas and culture throughout Europe can be ascribed to the invention of Gutenberg's movable type printing press. The uprisings caused by Wycliffe and Hus could be contained because, at the time, information could be easily controlled and confined. The power of the written word to disseminate knowledge, enhance scientific research, spread political ideas, and fan the flames of religious discontent. The printing press ultimately enabled the Italian Renaissance to diffuse into the Northern Renaissance, which emphasized religion and reform. In fact, the first major book printed in Europe was the Gutenberg Bible. A copy is shown here in the lower right. Eventually, the Bible became widely available in multiple translations. This was a factor often attributed to the rise and spread of the Protestant Reformation. A protest against the Catholic Church starting with Martin Luther, a Catholic monk who considered certain practices in his time just as objectionable as Wycliffe and Hus had previously. Luther sought to reform the church from within during the early 16th century. This seemingly small protest spread like wildfire throughout Europe due to the very influential printing press. This Protestant Reformation would eventually erupt into a multinational uprising that would later merge into the 30 Years' War, the most violent and destructive conflict in Europe for almost 3 centuries, until shots were fired in the First World War.
Mother, you're alive.
Too bad you
Will die.